we'll go ahead and get started. The youth were so efficient in their service. We can actually get going a little early. So today is a working session, just so you're all prepared. What we want to do today is really kind of bring our thoughts and our creative energies and our spirits together and discern in action what Matthew 25 really looks like for this congregation, concretely. Right? So, recommendations, suggestions, ideas for the way that we live into what Matthew 25 is calling us to do as a community of faith. Right? So, before we begin that, I'd like to start us with a word of prayer. God, we come before you in an attitude of discernment. We ask that your Spirit guide our conversation, guide our thoughts, guide our sharing in the directions that you would have us go in the world around us. That you would help us find the ways to serve you, to live into the promise of your kingdom, to live into the vision that Jesus painted for all of us, for the world. All of these things we pray in Christ's name. Amen. So with every other Sunday, we kind of start with a level set, a reminder of why we've undertaken this effort. And then a moment for me to share what it means for me. So our goal in offering these 4 faith formation studies is to, number one, provide a grounding into what being a Matthew 25 congregation is in general, and provide opportunities for each of us and for all of us collectively to begin thinking about what that looks like for Lakewood Presbyterian Church. The themes of the Matthew 25 vision are grounded in the gospel, as we've studied. Jesus calls us to serve with and for the, quote, least of these, my brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters. We've talked a bit about how that least of these is a kind of a loaded phrase, right? But part of what we need to do is discern who that population is among us and with us. These are people who are, as a group, not to be pitied, but who are deeply loved by Jesus. And consequently, we are called to deeply love as well. The tenets of the Matthew 25 vision are also embedded in our confessions, in the constitutional statements of our body of faith. For example, the Confession of 1967 condemns the evil of systemic poverty in our world. The Belhar Confession challenges us to confront racism in church and society. A brief statement of faith imagines congregations fully alive in the glory of God. Thus, Matthew 25 ministries are calling us to address poverty, racism, and congregational vitality. Now, my involvement in the Matthew 25 initiative stems from the way that Jesus' message of belonging, invitation, inclusion, and love have always spoken to me, actually, if I'm being honest, more than the message of salvation. I've always had a difficult time, personally, with the idea of a loving God and then judgment, hell, and damnation. I've had a difficult time reconciling those throughout my life and throughout my faith journey. I came to faith as a young adult, having participated in Sunday school in elementary grades, and then nothing beyond that until graduate school. From those early lessons, I took away a discomfort about the need to escape the punishment of this supposedly loving God through declarations of faith in God's Son. And those declarations being somewhat rote and ritualistic. The concept of the Trinity as a young child was well beyond me, so I didn't wrestle with that at that time either. When I encountered Christ in the gospel in graduate school, the Christ who flipped over tables in the temple, the one who scolded moneylenders for turning the household of God into a place of profit, who upbraided the religious authorities for assuming they could place boundaries on God's love and invitation and welcome. The Christ who opened his arms without judgment encouraged everyone to do the same in a spirit of openness and generosity. Then I was hooked. That Christ spoke to me in a way that I'd never been spoken to before. To this day, that is the Christ who is foremost in my faith and in my heart. That's the Christ I feel called to serve as I carry on Christ's example of love and caring for those around us, those brothers and sisters who are most vulnerable. So that's my own sort of personal faith journey into this moment. I would invite all of you at some point, as we're embarking on this journey together, to reflect on your own faith journeys and how Matthew 25 speaks to or appeals to your soul, your spirit, your heart. So you have in front of you this Session 4 document. It's a little long. I'm not going to read all of it. But you can now take these home. So we're finished with these after today. Feel free to read more deeply about the three focus areas. There are a couple of things I want to kind of land on consequentially as we begin this process of thinking together. The first, when we talk about congregational vitality, the denomination is clear that congregational vitality is really developed among the pastor and members of the congregation who lead as disciples and actively engage in the community around them. So congregational vitality is not just internal vitality, it's external vitality. It's the ways that we gain energy, hope, etc. from our faith and the ways that we take that out into the world around us. Okay? When we talk about dismantling structural racism, one of the things I want to make sure that gets communicated from the denomination's standpoint on this, and I think Jesus' standpoint as well, we tend to think of racism in terms of race, ethnicity. There are points of intersection, however, that we really need to keep in mind as we start to imagine what our work looks like in regards to racism. So it's not simply about the color of someone's skin. Intersectionality around gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, languages, disabilities, etc. Right? All of these things are areas where we're invited to break down barriers and create an inclusive spirit. Okay? And then lastly, when we talk about systemic poverty is deeply rooted in systems and processes and structures. And at the end of the day, there are people who benefit from those systems and processes. Right? There are bonuses to enabling, equipping, and maintaining the status quo. And in some cases, I would say many cases, we benefit from that status quo. So part of the process for dismantling structural racism is examining ourselves, our life as a congregation, and the ways that we participate in or passively support these systems and processes that keep people in poverty. Okay? So those are a couple things I want to kind of have in mind as we launch into a conversation around all of this. We've talked about Matthew 25, and I think Steve actually had a really good point that earlier in an earlier session that we kind of teased forward from there. In some ways, one of the ways that we can manage or deal with that problematic phrase, the least of these, right, is to think more in terms of vulnerability. The most vulnerable of these, my brothers and sisters. And there's this idea of seeing them, right? Sight. Because the people asked Jesus, when did we see you? Or when did we not see you? So I want to think about this sight, what it means to see others. And Aaliyah referenced something last Sunday about seeing Christ, seeing God in other people, because in the end we're all made in God's image. So I view this word see in this context of having three facets to it. The first is seeing with love. Seeing the image of God in the people around us, in everyone around us. So, seeing with love. It's a loving sight. The second is awareness. Right? So, now that I see them in Christ's love, how am I aware of who they are and how they struggle? How am I aware of their vulnerability? And the last is a seeing of responsiveness. Now that I see them and love them in God's image, now that I'm aware of the ways that they are challenged, threatened, pushed to the margins, how do I respond to them? So those are the kinds of things that I want us to keep in mind as we talk about seeing people, right? Seeing the communities that among us, around us, that we are called to partner with and to serve. So, the first question I want to pose to everybody is, who are we, specifically this body of Christ in this place and time? Who are we called to see? I was going to do this in small groups. I think actually my observation is you all function really well as a large body, right? You really feed off one another. So, who are we called to see in love, awareness, and response? Around us, among us, in our time and place. Thoughts? I'll go for it first, and we'll see. Offering the right forward.
I think it's hard. I think I need to learn a lot more about poverty.
Okay.
I see someone standing along the highway or at the exit asking for money, but I usually look away. So I mean, I just watched a video from self-development people, and there's so much about poverty, and I don't know.
So that gets to that awareness, right?
I really need, I need more awareness.
So one of the communities, one of the groups we need to see better are people who are poor, people who are struggling in poverty. But Cindy is saying there's a challenge in that, because what's the awareness? What are the reasons for that, right? Okay. Yes, Steve.
In the broadest terms, I'm going to say we are called to see those who discomfort us.
Okay.
I'm going to take both Cindy and Steve's comments, because I'm thinking about the poor, and there are images that may come to mind. I'll stand up because I'm wearing a mask. When we think of the poor, and I think when Steve said people would discomfort us, Ted and I were walking through Lakewood yesterday, day before, whatever night that was, and there was a person in the park right there by the Marx Plaza with a whole bunch of stuff and a grocery cart and a big sign saying, "These are the things I need." And I remember seeing her there and thinking, oh, we used to not see this in downtown Lakewood. It was more downtown Cleveland. So I think there's that piece where that makes us uncomfortable. We walk along and we see someone who's obviously on the street with all of her possessions. And how do we respond to that? And there are probably a lot of different opinions on that. There are those who say, give every time someone asks you because you can, and others who go, oh, no, don't do that because that encourages it and perpetuates it. We all have to search within ourselves and figure out where we are on that. So I think there's that part of seeing. We see people who do make us uncomfortable and make us aware of their living situations. I think also if we're looking at people who are living below the poverty level, we often do not see those folks. Those are folks who are in school with our kids, who are on free or reduced lunches, and they may look like they're okay and their families are doing all right, but they may be, one paycheck away from being out of their house. I think again about the child tax credit, which started last July and ended in December. The number of families whose lives were changed by that tax credit and now are back to scrambling and trying to figure out how to keep their kids fed or how to pay for daycare so mom can still go to work and dad can go to work or whatever. So I think there's the very obvious part of poverty that we see and a lot of really horrendous poverty that we can be oblivious to because it's not on the streets in front of us. Which goes to Cindy's point, I think, about needing education about what we aren't aware of.
Right. So James says it might be people who come into our church and we don't know their situation. Correct. They come for comfort, they come for hope. I think so. I like that concept of people who discomfort us. I think that's pretty informative here. So if you kind of think about the people in our community, the people you may feel alien from, right? The people who make you uncomfortable, the people who have needs that their needs make you uncomfortable. Who are those people?
The mentally ill. We encountered a man walking on 17 the other day, talking out loud with a walker, yelling. You never know what to...
So yeah, the mentally ill, those struggling with mental illness in a very public or obvious way. Jim?
Along with what Bonnie just said, which I think is even more pronounced, are people in emotional pain of one kind or another. Some of you may not know this, but we have two Al-Anon, very active Al-Anon groups here, both of whom are attended by and overseen by members of the church. But there's a lot of people in all kinds of emotional pain. And I think that's one of the screening needs in Lakewood. Places, safe places to be with others and feel support or some kind of help.
I think that's a big umbrella category too. You've got people in emotional pain. I mean, addiction.
Yeah.
Addiction rates have skyrocketed during the course of the pandemic. Mental illness, right, the incidence of mental illness or rates of mental illness also have skyrocketed during the pandemic.
Continues to rise.
Overdose, correct.
And the grief that goes with that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think this really to branch kind of on what Laura said, this whole idea of seeing, like when we think of mental illness and people wandering the streets and stuff, and the poverty and stuff like that, we do think of people who make us uncomfortable to begin with, but at the same time, almost all of these start at a level where people are within our church and you don't know. I would guarantee you that you have walked in church today and talked to someone who's on anxiety medication. I guarantee you that you've walked in here and talked to someone who has been in a situation in their life where they have been paycheck to paycheck. We don't necessarily make you feel uncomfortable if we're one of those people at this level. It takes a lot to get you to the other levels that make you say, oh, why is that person like that? And I think that if we start to look and see the need within our own community, the people who are hurting, the people who are alcoholics that are sitting right next to you that might smell a little bit of booze when they come in, something like that, When we start to recognize and see them as human and as our neighbor and as the people that are within our family, our church family, then we can start to understand how it gets to that level of someone being on the street. If you've been paycheck to paycheck and you've lost that last job, then that's where you go. If you are mentally unstable and you have no support, that's where you go. There is no other place. So I think we need to see the need earlier before. And it's kind of like when the guy who came in to talk about refugees said, you know, I can help at the bottom of the river with all the people who are drowning, but let's go find why they're getting in the river. You know, we need to start seeing that need earlier.
I would say children,
Yeah.
the youth right now is a big place to start. I've been substitute teaching this entire last school year, and the amount of children who are on IEPs and 504s, like individualized education plans, who struggle with anxiety and depression, especially after the last 2 years. These children are hurting in a lot of ways, and they need all the assistance they can get. And I think a lot of that hurt comes out in kind of these outbursts that you see. I think a lot of kids, generationally, there's a gap, right, between kind of the people who are like 12 to 20, 12 to 24 right now, and you know, people who are older than that. And there's a lack of understanding between them. They don't understand, like, for example, your generation, my parents' generation, might not understand why 15-year-olds are acting the way they're acting, why they're kind of being obnoxious, maybe. But it's their cry for help, right? A lot of times there's so much more deeper going on. And I think that gets written off as just being kind of young and stupid and ignorant in a way. But there's hurt underlying. And I think to your point of addressing it early, addressing it in schools and at that age, which is so pivotal, can prevent kind of down the line more compounding feelings of insecurities, feelings of worthlessness, and leading to greater mental instability. And so I think addressing it in the youth, in schools, and outreach programs in schools is incredibly important.
Steve.
Part of the reason I use that word discomfort is not, and here I'm speaking very personal, I'm going to not guilt trip anybody, I'll just talk about myself. If I'm discomforted enough, I have to start asking some questions that I might not normally ask.
Right.
And therefore seeking to participate in these people's lives in ways that are not simply the convenient thing for me to do. So my convenient thing to do is I'll bake you a cake or I'll buy a lasagna for you. Well, that's part of the comfort. It's real easy. I'll buy a stuffer, lasagna, and give it to somebody who's hungry, and Jesus will say, well, you're now the sheep. No. What if they don't need that? This poor person really needs guidance toward housing, really needs guidance toward that job, needs childcare. Well, I don't know. I'm just saying that the response that's demanded at comfortable Steve is going to be discomfort.
Well, and to some degree, it involves relationship too. Yeah, right. I think you help that person most effectively when you enter into a relationship with them in some capacity. Right. There has to be some degree of understanding and trust there, so that you can, if you can tap them into resources appropriate to their need, right, they trust you to guide them in that way. Right? And consequently, you have an understanding and empathy for what it is they need.
Generalization is incredibly dangerous, and we need to steer away from generalizing kind of people who are maybe impoverished, people who are struggling with mental illness. We can't group them all together because they have their own individual needs, and they are their own individual.
On both sides, from the helper to the helpee, I'm going to use those two terms. is a sense of fear. The helper is not sure. They fear it's getting out of the box.
Right.
The helpee, the helpee, the one that needs the help, isn't real sure about what's going to happen here. And you know what? They might be comfortable in their box. That's all they know right now. They're comfortable in their box.
It involves risk. Absolutely. Yeah. Jeff.
I don't know where to jump in here. Several years ago, when the first book came out, Addicted, and I read it because I was interested. It was a PhD thesis, and this person had embedded into various housing situations in his community. My attitude before that was always, so you're evicted, pay your rent, and you won't get evicted. And he went in and told the stories and lived the stories, and something spoke, something broke in me or whatever, that the key to all of us is education. And somebody else mentioned that I haven't heard all of everybody said. Something, before we can do anything, we have to really feel that, and we have to know that. It's easy to put money in a pot to provide something. And another, I think maybe this is what I'm sorry. Maybe. And several years ago, when I was a new adult and had my first professional job, I was in my 40s, early 40s, and I was at an institution with a high percentage gay population. I knew that population existed, but this just got back me right in the face. I mean, I had a kid sitting across the room telling me, Dean Joe, I can't go home for Christmas because his parents won't let him come home because he might infect his nieces and nephews. And went on from there. And more and more in the news, we're all hearing that a parent who is assisting with a child with transgender issues can be arrested for child abuse. Now that's speaking to the parent, but it's speaking to the child. I'm saying child, but I mean whoever it is, whatever it is. I don't know how Al-Anon started here. Al-Anon, that's not AA, it's Al-Anon or the families. I don't know how that started. But there's a need, and that need is across all the issues. You get race, you get poverty, whatever, that whole issue of sexuality and sexual orientation is very real. We bounce around it and say a lot of different words. And I don't know where to go from there with that.
Well, I think that gets to that intersectionality, right, that we talked about a little bit. If you think about, Abraham was talking about kids in school age children, even young adults, and then the intersection of gender identity in that. I mean, the fact of the matter is that school-age children who are trying to discern where they are in their gender identity, they are under attack in this country.
The level of suicide is high.
And they have one of the highest levels of suicide among that age group. That's not a coincidence.
And there's studies that show how I have to call myself somebody very, that's one of the most important things that we can do is provide an atmosphere of acceptance, an atmosphere of encouragement, compassion.
So
I'm
maybe trans, LGBTQ plus. Yeah, David, yes.
Yeah, I would like to, what Abraham said about the youth, our children, I would say that some who are raised in homes that are comfortable with serious domestic violence, they should be valued, and also those people with serious handicaps.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, what physical disabilities? Right. Yes. Jane.
I'm sure for the time I worked in middle school in Lakewood, and I think that middle school is special if you're dealing with any of these things we're discussing. I used to watch the kids walking down the hall between periods, and I thought, my gosh, it's like they had eyes all over their body, because they were so aware. I mean, at that time we weren't thinking about these other things. I mean, oh, but, I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much discomfort. I'm glad I'm not back at this time, because they're just so aware.
Yeah. Very self-conscious.
Yeah. They're aware of everything. They're super smart. These kids are very smart, very intuitive, and they notice things going on around them. Yeah.
We're going to need to move on to the next topic. One other group of people, to my mind, especially within Lakewood, I would say maybe immigrants and refugees, right? Lakewood is a primary area of housing for newly arrived immigrants and refugees who are being settled in this area. So I would have that notice too. So when we think about the peoples whom we are called to see in this way, we kind of look at the three focus areas. What are some of the responses? What are some of the kinds of things we can engage in when we talk about poverty, and poverty in vulnerable peoples, the vulnerable peoples we've discussed? What are some of the responses that we as a community can take relative to addressing systemic poverty? Cindy actually, she said education, right? She doesn't know what she doesn't know. I think that's probably true for all of us, honestly. Like, what's the level of abuse in SNAP? I mean, I grew up, my mom was convinced that anybody on a social welfare program was cheating the system, right? And I have colleagues that I work with. Anytime SNAP, WIC, any of those kinds of programs come up, they're like, yeah, they're just deadbeats. They're taking advantage of the system, right? How do we have conversations with people about that? Because the fact of the matter is that SNAP has probably the lowest abuse percentage among any federal program. And there are far more people taking advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program and purchasing like luxury cars and things like that through that money than ever happens on SNAP or WIC. Right. So, education around maybe the social safety net. What else? What other kinds of education would you feel you would want to have in order to be able to talk about these issues?
I just the learning about systemic racism through bullying and redlining and all that, I was totally kind of oblivious to that until a couple years ago. So I think, and I know that they said most of us in the middle class have profited from that, maybe being unaware of it, but with the borrowing and so on. So yeah, I'd like to know more about that.
Okay, absolutely.
And I think, this is following up on what Linda just said, I think people are unaware in this country how our policies have been formed over the years that actually keep people poor and keep black people oppressed in ways that don't seem like something this country would be doing. And those of you who have done the racial wealth gap simulation know what I'm talking about. You look at these policies that we've had in the last couple hundred years in this country and go, these can't be real, and surely they weren't intended to do this, but they do. And so I think education around what we have voted for and supported, been complicit in, whether or not we've done it with awareness, I think that kind of education is really important. Because we can't begin to change any of that at a federal level until we're aware of what's actually going on.
Joe.
A simple thing, just recently, okay, I forget, FHC, what is that, Forest Hills Church?
Yes.
They have a Black Caucus, and I've been participating in their book study every 2 months. The last one, I can't remember the name of the book right now, which was a surprise in education, was how our tax, the way we tax, our income tax, the IRS, and how it's anti-racist. And they spell out the things.
Anti-racist or racist?
Racist, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, but it keeps people where they think they should be. And
When billionaires pay
I don't
nothing.
understand taxes, but just the idea of it, I mean, a lot of you know or work with taxes can understand how that works against or trying to do anything.
So when we look then at educating ourselves around issues of systemic poverty and kind of being able to better understand and articulate the kind of the causes of that. So that's that second, that's an awareness, right? What's the response that comes out of that then? Once we know better, how do we respond? Aaliyah?
I think in learning about what people in poverty need at the top, like what will help them turn around their situation rather than addressing even just immediate needs. We could think of things like job training programs where we collaborate and bring people in for that. We could think about opening up our Wi-Fi on a certain day for people to come in who need to run a home business or something like that. There are lots of groups that are doing office sharing and things like that. But so if we think sort of outside the box in ways where we can enable people to get jobs, then that helps them address that poverty issue. Because, you know, we think, oh, well, they can just go to the library. Well, you have to have an address to go to the library and use it, to use the library card. You can't just go if you're homeless and things like that.
That's intentional, by the way. That's
yeah.
Policies and practices.
Yeah, so there are small things that we could think about doing ourselves to open up and help address these issues realistically.
Other thoughts, other ideas, I think those are fantastic suggestions. Other ideas about how we respond.
Advocating for changes.
Advocacy. Yes, okay.
In one of the recent newsletters from Habitat for Humanity, they talked about how the after 1 year of being in a Habitat home, the wealth that thousands of dollars of wealth that they have already they have now.
Yep.
And with like the redlining, different things that Linda mentioned, and policies that have kept people out of homes, I just think a lot of our generational wealth comes through home ownership and
absolutely
helping people find ways to be housed too in their
okay, yeah, so Habitat, affordable housing, yeah.
And I want to jump on the advocacy piece, which I think David mentioned. We've done some work in this congregation before with groups like Bread for the World There are groups out there that make advocacy really easy, and when I'm talking advocacy right now, I'm talking about engaging with our elected officials. And I know there are people in churches who are freaked out about that because they don't think that's what we're called to do. You and I can talk about that because I would disagree about that, but it's not being partisan to be political. Being political is working to try to change the system, which is exactly what Aaliyah was just talking about. Changing some of the things that keep people in the oppressed systems. And I think if we are willing to connect with our elected officials around change in programs, that's really important work. And groups like Bread for the World do that. They help you write letters to your officials, and their focus is primarily anti-poverty, anti-hunger, but because of these things don't exist in a vacuum. A lot of their work now is also anti-racism as well as anti-poverty and anti-hunger. Groups like Habitat are amazing. There are other groups that we can connect with that do advocacy. There's a group in the Cleveland area called Greater Cleveland Congregations, which is a group of people made up of people from congregations around the Greater Cleveland area that over recent years have done advocacy work in a very show up and be present kind of way, where they will book events with elected officials and people show up to make it clear that those of us in our communities of faith, we do care about things like, a recent one has been criminal justice reform. So it's getting people to show up and make it clear that we are paying attention, that we vote, because ultimately there's a lot of power around the vote, and that's where the advocacy piece comes in. And there are groups in our area in Cleveland that we could be engaging with around that.
I think if we just have a list of these groups, because a lot of us aren't aware, how to provide information, that would be very helpful.
Okay, so like a local resource directory, if you will,
right,
for ways to engage.
Right.
Like local, state, and national,
right,
just to be aware of it.
And maybe by topic area, right? Are you interested in engaging in this? Here are 3 or 4 organizations you can reach out to.
Yeah.
What did it? So, Aaliyah, I think you have a good idea about the Wi-Fi, and
yes.
What about our fiscal resources, kind of in a broader context too? So I'm thinking that the job training thing. Lakewood Christian Services Center does job training. We are a mission partner with them. But what if they're resource constrained in terms of space? Like what if they want to hold a job fair, but they don't have a place to hold the job fair? Well, we've got a lot of space. We've got Wi-Fi, and we've got, what if their people what do the people they serve need a place to come to work on resumes, right? Or things like that. Or do research, for job training or all of that. So, yeah, I would kind of, if you're okay with it, I would like to kind of expand that broader, just talk about our resources, our physical resources in general, including things like, the Wi-Fi and other sort of infrastructures that we have in place.
Skills, but they don't have to pay, they can come and get the training that they need.
So
Even things like reading.
Skills training.
I was thinking about reading when I saw being older, I thought maybe that was teaching basic reading skills. Or opportunity for women who live in this country or haven't had much of an education, or just these other things, teach them freeness.
So yeah, Jay's talking about skills training. We have a lot of talent and knowledge in this congregation. So things like basic budgeting, tutoring for reading, or engaging around, how to write a resume, right? All sorts of things like that we can either plug people from here into agencies that do that, or we can provide a space and people to help an agency do that. Joe.
You mentioned Greater Cleveland Congregation, GCC. I think they're a very effective group. However, I understand there's a cost involved for congregations to be part of it. So if we did the same thing for just Lakewood, I don't know how many churches there are in Lakewood.
good point. I mean, so Joe's saying, what about engaging with and collaborating with other congregations just in Lakewood? Grace Presbyterian, for example, is on fire for mission. With Lou Will there. I mean, they are absolutely, completely passionate, deeply passionate about engaging in the Lakewood community and really serving the people of Lakewood. So, yeah, what are some of the ways that we can be collaborate, even be better together?
As far as using our own spaces, what about a support and safe space for groups like LGBTQA to meet? A meal, a place where they can interact, offer some support, educated support, and almost maybe like an AA meeting, with some place that is safe that they can go to that can be regular and use their church facilities and amplify that.
To that point, I think the assumption a lot of times in relation to LGBTQIA plus people and churches is, unless it's specifically said otherwise, that's not necessarily a safe space, right? Just because of the culture that a lot of churches have cultivated, it needs to be outwardly shown to the community that we are a safe space for the LGBT community.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways maybe it's implied, but I look at, so the church that Aaron and Abraham were involved in school, Aaron is still sort of engaged there in Bowling Green, they are what's called a More Light congregation. For those of you who are familiar with More Light, More Light is an actual designation for a church body that is open and inclusive of people across the gender identity spectrum and different sexual orientations. And they declare it and claim it. It's part of their their tagline for their identity. It's First Presbyterian Church, Bowling Green, a More Light congregation. Now, for people who know what that means, it's immediately evident to them. If they don't know what it means, it's pretty clear by the big rainbow flag that's a part of their logo as well. Right, so, and they also just recently did a training for any member who wanted to be involved in it, as well as all of their elders. I think it was called Safe Space.
Certified safe space.
Right, and so it's an actual certification you go through, but essentially it is an awareness training around issues of gender identity to equip you to speak and interact in a loving and inclusive and welcoming manner, and kind of check yourself for assumptions and microaggressions, so that you're able to welcome people across the gender identity spectrum into your space in a way that's completely free of judgment. So, but there are programs out there like that. So maybe actually offering a program like that to the congregation to help us learn how to talk to groups that we may not be comfortable talking to at first. So Marie's idea, so you were talking about using the space to have some type of a literal safe space for especially youth, like school-age youth, around who are struggling with sexual orientation, or may not be struggling with it, but they don't necessarily feel like they have a space that welcomes them because of their gender identity or their sexual expression, right? So
that's what I'm not necessarily in an age group, but just the baby, and likening it to the weekly meetings of Al-Anon or any other group that meets weekly, that this would be a place where they can meet weekly. And I think sharing, being around the meal as a Christian tradition is necessary. And then to offer education, speakers, psychologists, whatever, I'm sure those people have, I don't know people, but people in that category have questions as well, and they probably don't find them easily answered anywhere. So we could educate ourselves first, we could offer that, but it would be supportive, understanding, continual.
So some kind of like fellowship or just for outreach.
Right.
Cindy's been waiting, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think some of these things that we've talked about would also go under the church vitality space.
Yeah, I think the goal is that by the time we get to vitality, it's kind of self-evident. So, Joe.
Picking up there, not only will that assist in helping a particular individual, primarily the young person, but it would also help us. I'm speaking personally, but I have grandchildren. So I'm wondering, so this would help me to speak with them on the issue.
So it actually fosters growth in you to enable you and empower you to connect with the children and grandchildren in your life in deeper ways. Right. So when we look at other groups, we talk about sort of ways that there are people pushed to the margins or made vulnerable. What are some other peoples or groups that we can work with and among? And this is not to discount what we do already. For example, I think we're very engaged with metanoia. That doesn't go away. That becomes reframed, right? The metanoia outreach, the programs that we undertake with metanoia, it's all a part of our understanding of how we are called to address issues of poverty and racism. And mental illness too, because a lot of the people in that population, they have significant mental illness, which is one of the reasons they may be homeless to begin with.
If you're looking at the community, refugees and immigrants,
Okay.
It's low-hanging fruit. I mean, this is a magnet, and there's got to be some way that we could use our resources to help support either refugees or immigrants or both, or a family or two or something. I think this is all about our context. Our context is all about refugees and immigrants, about young people struggling with their own issues of all kinds, and also emotional people in psychic and emotional pain. I've just seen miracles at Al-Anon groups, at AA groups, suicide support, all those things, in those small, intimate group atmospheres where just incredible stuff happens. They're probably not going to walk into a worship service. We need to get over that. But one way that they can maybe stick their toe in the water at the church are through some of these kinds of groups, knowing that they're there because we do care.
Good. The context issue, because, and I don't want to take away any of what we've talked about and not keep our feet on the fire about some of those things. But let me just mention 3 issues that are really big in our society, and I guess here as well, that this church could address. Grandparents raising their grandchildren. 12% of the children in this country are not living with their parents anymore. And I did this for 2.5 years. And you need people around you who understand what it's like to be 65 and going to the kindergarten party. So reach out to people who are parents again. Depression is everywhere. What are we doing to help people who are depressed? Talk to them. A third one is caregivers who are dealing with family members who have Alzheimer's dementia. And they really are the people thinking they're going crazy. Because the people who have it don't think they're going crazy. They're perfectly happy not knowing. But the family members who have to be the caregivers, they are strung out to the limit. And they need tremendous support to sit together and find out they haven't lost it, and that there are lots of things in the community that could help them. So these are 3 different kind of poverties, if you will, that exist in our society that you could then use the facility to have small groups where people can feel like I'm not alone in this.
We see in our own congregation, I mean, the last 10, 15 years, the number of spouses caring for someone in dementia issues, it's everywhere, and it's getting worse. The numbers are growing. But also, Steve, thank you for the grandparent raising children thing. Didn't even occur to me, but it's true. It's everywhere.
And that is it, that's the death, having been there and worked with these people, I call it the death of dreams. They live with the death of dreams. And folks, when your dreams are dying, because you're going to be 80 when they finally leave your house, and everything you thought you were going to do when you retire is gone. It's hard. It's really hard.
I hadn't thought about that as being a need, but you're right, because I was a grandparent. I was the only grandparent in the Band Boosters Club. And I never thought about it as being a need. It's just, well, I was there, and I worked, and I did what I did. But that's right. That is a need.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
If we can utilize agencies that already exist and maybe target more of the Lakewood population, but I'm thinking of the National Association of Mental Illness, Greater Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of support groups. I know that Family to Family is not here, which is a wonderful program for people with the mentally ill that don't know what to do. But I'm thinking contacting them. They have peer support groups, and that might, and also the Alzheimer's Association. I think if we could make a space available, if they were interested in meeting on the west side, and, that might be something practical to do. Where we just have space, basically, for them.
Absolutely. So kind of space captures some of these ideas too, but to kind of move it to the vitality portion of this, I think Jim had a great point. A lot of the people who end up walking through the doors to receive the welcome, the love, etc. of Christ, they will not end up in the pews, right? So vitality in and of itself, it's not about the butts in the pews. It's about the way the Spirit moves among, through, in, around us, and then connects us to the community, so that our energy, our faith feeds the community feeds our energy and our faith. Right? So I think the hope is that engaging in the work does that. Yes, but let's be honest. Energy there, you do lose energy and momentum, right? So it's not a matter of, I don't think it's necessarily a matter of initially creating the vitality, it's maintaining the vitality. So I want to talk about vitality in that context.
Do these things and it'll be vital. The vitality will come. Sort of like building the dreams or whatever it was.
Right.
It'll come. I mean, that will speak for itself amongst ourselves and amongst others.
Well,
how do we keep it going? Because that's the bigger question, Jim.
Manageable bites.
Yes.
If you do too much, I'm telling you, I'm warning you, the energy will suck out. The needs are huge. You've got to zero in and know what you can do, what we can do together, what is not going to tax 2 or 3 people over a few months or years. And I think that's reasonable, take on what is a reasonable thing, focus, don't have 15 different things on the menu, and I think that will help the energy level. That's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I've been here more years than I think any of you have. And I'm telling you, don't overdo it. Don't overdo it. Do a few things really well, and you'll see incredible results.
Laura, you're going to have to come there.
We all do. We're just
Cindy.
I think it's really important that as individuals, as groups, that we take time to pray and meditate and listen for what God is calling each of us to do as individuals and groups, because I think that, I believe that if we are called to do something, that will energize us and fulfill us and keep us going, but you can't do everything. And so I think as individuals and as a congregation, we have a lot of work to do. I have work to do in that regard, because I am Miss Volunteer, and I can't do that and do a good job with, too many things. So let God lead us. Let God lead me.
I would say self-reflection is continuous self-reflection is incredibly important, because the reality is if we ourselves are not where we need to be able to do the work, we can't expect others to be able to do the work as well. We cannot give of ourselves to help change systems and to help enact change in our community if we are not ourselves grounded and aware of what we are trying to do every single day, and challenging ourselves to think differently, act differently than we see people in our country acting, right? If we disagree with something in our country, we need to challenge ourselves to be an agent of change for that. And we need to make sure that mentally, emotionally, we are capable and safe enough to do that.
So, go ahead.
Sorry, I'd like to piggyback on that a little bit, as in, just to realize that this is all a connection to. We can't just write all these things on the board and say, wouldn't this be nice to have? Okay, you go do it. We have to really be energized ourselves to do this, because that's the only way that it works. And I think that that's been a stumbling block for us a little bit, is we have a lot of great wishes, but we wish for someone else to do it.
That's not going to work right.
Yeah, Jane.
I think each one of us should look at ourselves. And we're all pieces in a puzzle, and every piece is important. But we have to be honest with ourselves in what skill we might be able to bring to it. And then we should pick out, if we're going to have some activities, one that best fits our ability and our personality. I believe same for me with attention. And with my age, do the best with someone.
So engaging an area of your passion.
Yeah. I put self-awareness up here because that goes along with that, knowing what your skills are, knowing what your talents are, but also knowing kind of your capacity, how much you can give at any given time. Because, today it might be different than 2 weeks from now if something happens, and you need to be aware of how much you can and how much you are willing to give of yourself at any given time.
So for just a concrete thought from, Cindy's talking about awareness, reflection, etc. Something perhaps like a regular devotional, like a Matthew 25 devotional, that prompts you to reflect on something and then connects to Scripture. Right? So one last thing, we're kind of over, but it's been fabulous so far. But one last thing I wanted to kind of think about is how does music fit into any of this? Yeah, I just over here looking at Kathy, and I'm like, one thing that has not come up, despite our inclination and our gifts as a congregation, is
I think sometimes just familiarity of music makes things a lot more welcoming sometimes. For example, I remember one time we did a community sing, and we had a lot of beautiful songs, and we invited people to come in and sing them, but we forgot to tell them what page numbers the things were on. They were not familiar Christmas carols, and the congregation, or the people who came in off the street, just sat there and were like, I don't know what's going on. But part of that is a part of the welcoming atmosphere. If we choose something that we know is going to be familiar every now and again, then that makes people not feel like an outsider. That makes them want to come back and bring their children back to something that's familiar to them and familiar to other churches. So I think incorporating that sometimes, or realizing incorporating that can help. And also the contemporary occasionally can bring in the young. I think just understanding how people respond to music can be really a part of the welcoming atmosphere.
Joe.
One more thing on awareness. I heard on NPR or something 2 weeks ago, and how there's a congregation that when they sing a hymn, that was the Sweeney speech area,
African American spiritual.
Slave people, that we make a little donation or whatever out of that to the local school, maybe not local, who is working with that.
Yeah, because the reality is that most of the spirituals of enslaved peoples that we sing in church, there's no historic royalty to any of that, right? And so there's this idea of reparations around that.
Right, and it also can increase our awareness of both.
What are the roots of this?
Where did this come from? Yeah.
Rowan and the music person at Plymouth in Shaker Heights were actually talking about doing some educational piece around that. And I don't know whatever happened with that, because now sadly Rowan's not here anymore. But looking more closely at that.
So, yeah, I would maybe encourage some additional thought around how our music ministry works into what we're talking about.
I think one of the things we need to be aware of is the lyrics that we sing in hymns that we pick or anthems that we pick. And I think a lot of times we hear things that are, like Aaliyah said, we like familiar songs because they're familiar to us, and at different levels of familiarity come from different life experiences. But I went to this incredibly powerful workshop at a white privilege conference this spring, and one of the things they talked about was the language that traditionally white churches use. And I think we have to be so careful about what we're standing up and singing every day. And if we really look at the words and the lyrics and the message that is giving, if you have someone come into church who has not been churched, or isn't Christian, or isn't a white Christian, and they hear some of the hymns we're singing, those could be really off-putting. And I think we're unaware of it because a lot of us have just grown up singing these.
There's a reason we don't sing Onward Christian Soldiers.
For example. Yeah.
James.
There's a scripture in a church called and Peggy listened at our last meeting. She explained how our new hymn came to be. And I think that would be an excellent program for us to have, because she talked about how they examine every single song. I think there's something 800 songs. And exactly, and they took out a lot of things that they don't use anymore, and
something that's familiar to us might not be familiar to anybody else, and something that's familiar to another population might not be familiar to us. So a willingness to kind of develop new familiarities, maybe based on who we're trying to reach, who we are trying to make relationships with. Understand and listen to what they are familiar, what's familiar to them, and kind of being willing to adopt that into our own comfort zone.
All right. Fabulous conversation. Thank you all so much. So in 2 weeks' time, I hope you all are going to be coming to the potluck to celebrate Pentecost. But another thing that we'll be doing there is sharing results, preliminary results from the survey. And actually, this conversation will factor into the report back of those results as well. So if you want to kind of get an idea of how this is all sort of forming together and have additional input and see where you might plug into that or where you might be kind of empowered and passionate to participate, please come to the Pentecost Potluck. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
God bless.